We can start now.
Thanks very much, and a very warm welcome, everybody, to session S5 of Geneva Trade Week 2020. This session has the title Trade Policy and Climate. Which instruments have the greatest potential for the WTO to build back better? My name is Rob Watt. I am the Communications Director at SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be your moderator today for a fantastic panel. This session is 90 minutes long. We've got 60 minutes during which we'll hear from Sweden's Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Cooperation and a panel of experts on different aspects of trade policy and climate and how we can look ahead. We're going to try and make this session as interactive as possible for you. That means that you'll be able to answer chat or pose questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor those questions. You'll also have the opportunity in our last 30 minutes to intervene and tell us what you think are the key priorities in this space. The other thing you'll be able to do is answer some polls, and you can see now a poll up on your screen. Please go ahead and try and answer it in the remaining 30 seconds. The result we'll share with you after we've heard from our first speaker, the Minister. This poll is really trying to set the scene here and shows you what we're trying to achieve in this session. This session is all about being fact-based, trying to work out how trade policy can support the climate regime, trying to work out which instruments really are the ones that are standing in the way or have the most potential to support the achievement of our climate goals. And it's meant to be forward-looking to the Ministerial Conference 12 next year, to the Build Back Better agenda, and of course the COP26, which rounds off 2021. We'll be looking at the policies, looking at the mix and sequencing of the policies, and try to answer the question, who does what, when? And without any further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to our first speaker, Minister Anna Hallberg, who is the Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs of Sweden. Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Distinguished guests, I'm so pleased to open today's seminar on how WTO can play a crucial role in building back better. Free trade is a vital tool to accomplish positive change in the world. And right now, I do believe that we are facing a momentum when it comes to joining forces in order to combat climate change. This is not a time for less cooperation or more protectionism. On the contrary, international cooperation is needed more than ever, and WTO can play a crucial role. We see a changing trade environment. Digitalization and global value chains, they have challenged traditional conceptions of trade, and the WTO must adapt to this new reality. The WTO must adapt by modernizing and filling the gaps in its rulebook and changing the way it operates. Modern trade must be based on principle of openness and promote sustainable development. We should strive for rules that support global growth and underpin environmental goals. The WTO rules should also facilitate the participation of developing and least developed countries, benefit women and men equally, and contribute to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. Trade remains the most important driver of global growth, innovation and employment. It's also a vital instrument for poverty reduction and fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. Free trade provides access to new markets, increases efficiency of resource allocation, lowers prices for consumers, and promotes access to technologies. Climate change is one of the most urgent global issues. Therefore, we need to move to concrete action and put climate at the top of the global agenda and make sure that trade and climate policies are mutually supportive. Trade can indeed contribute to positive environmental effects by a more efficient use of resources and by introducing new, more competitive products and solutions in the global trade arena, leading to reduced emissions. The growth created by new trade opportunities also create opportunities for climate measures. So, through trade, the negative environmental impact can be reduced, sustainable consumption can be strengthened, and a circular economy. Trade can be key to implement a common sustainability agenda as confirmed in Agenda 2030. And trade policy can contribute much more to positive emission development, for instance, by promoting the spreading of emission reduction technologies and services globally. Well, will this be easy then? Of course not. Being sustainable is a choice. One of the most important choices we have to make right now. And by making one choice, you opt out another one. Sometimes this means that you will have to refrain from the less costly in the short run, but also refrain from maybe the dirtiest choice and the dirtiest alternative in order to be sustainable. However, in the long run, I'm absolutely convinced that climate-friendly goods and services are the most cost-effective and also, I'm sure, the most competitive alternatives. Liberalizing trade in environmental goods and green technology would increase global accessibility of green technology and renewable energy. This is especially important for developing countries where access to technology is lower cost is crucial to green transition possibilities. There's an obvious win-win situation here, where trade can contribute to transition to more sustainable societies. Sweden would absolutely like to see the new climate-friendly technology, goods and services being underpinned by full liberalization from tariffs and barriers. We are strong supporters of the environmental goods negotiations. Given the urgency of the climate action, the need for trade policies that enable this transition is more important than ever. A report of the Swedish National Board of Trade, which I know that you will hear quite soon from a colleague from the National Board of Trade from Sweden, that report shows the leverage of an efficient trade policy could have on climate. For example, trade defense on renewable energy is a serious problem. Trade barriers targeting goods necessary for wind or solar energy make this more expensive and the green transition slower. The conclusions of the report are that trade policy is underutilized in reaching the climate goals, so let us seize this opportunity. Trade and climate need to be addressed in a concrete and forward-looking way at the WTO MC12 meeting. Delivering on environment and climate during that conference would send a message that WTO could contribute to the climate and environmental work. Sweden has a strong engagement for open, free and fair trade and a strong rule-based multilateral trading system. Trade and climate are high on the political agenda, and we will continue to be a promoter to sustainable trade and green transition. I therefore urge the WTO and its members to relaunch the negotiations on environmental goods and services. Let's show a strong commitment for declaration on environment at MC12. I think the MC12 is really a tipping point where we need to show progress in this area. Otherwise, I think we are really in a deep problem here. So we need to do this together. And to repeat, now is the momentum to join forces to combat climate change. And for me as a trade minister, of course, I would like to also to underline again, trade policy could be one of the most powerful tools in this context. Thank you very much for having the opportunity for the introduction speech at this very, very important seminar and important topic. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for that inspiring speech, both with a vision for how trade can be a great contributor to reaching climate goals, but also very specific about some of the next steps for both the ministerial conference next year, but also in the more detailed area of the environmental goods agreement and negotiations there. I think you've given us a bit of a target to aim for in our following discussions. You will have seen in the poll answer, although very few people managed to perhaps put in an answer, that there is a majority of people who tend to feel that currently the trade regime isn't doing as much as it could to support the achievement of climate goals. I think that was a sort of message that you see there's a huge potential as well in your speech. You indicated that. But interesting, there were quite a lot of people who said that they weren't comfortable giving an answer. I won't interpret why that was, but rather say and look to Emily, who's our next speaker, who's going to be able to provide us with some of the facts, put the evidence on the table through two reports that she and colleagues have written from the National Board of Trade in Sweden, and try and sort of answer some of these questions about whether or not trade is helping or hindering. And Emily, I want to ask you actually, first of all, if you'd been asked to answer that question, what would you have said?
Well, I'll develop on that subject. Thank you, Robert, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion about climate and the future of the WTO. We are all aware of the urgency to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the need of everyone and all policy instruments to contribute to the transition to a more climate-friendly world. At the same time, multilateral negotiations at the WTO have been very difficult for the WTO membership for a long time, and the WTO has hardly been able to achieve anything multilaterally since its inception, and not either plurilaterally as regards climate issues. Therefore, we, like many others, have analyzed and studied what we could do in the meantime, unilaterally or plurilaterally, within the WTO's existing rules and instruments to facilitate the transition. Before I present our reports, I just have to say that taking actions unilaterally or plurilaterally would, however, be a second best option. Most of all, we would prefer multilateral solutions in order to maintain a strong rules-based trading system, and also because such solutions are often optimal from an economic point of view. However, these options are not mutually exclusive, and many multilateral agreements have in fact been developed from plurilateral to multilateral ones. So unilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral instruments could rather complement each other and could be pursued in parallel to reinforce each other. The studies that I will present today were both commissioned by the Swedish government. They address two different approaches of supporting climate goals with trade policy. The first report focuses on possible reforms to make climate-relevant goods less costly, and the second report on making goods responsible for large emissions more expensive. So to the first report, you can see the front page on the next slide. Do you know how to change the slide? sorry, I don't manage to change the slide here. So the first report, you can see a miniature of the front page on the slide. It's on trade barriers to goods and services important to climate action. It looks at examples of trade barriers for goods and services that are important for enabling an increased use of renewable energy and cleaner road transport. And the sectors were chosen since the energy and transport sectors account for the largest share of total greenhouse gas emissions globally, and since cleaner alternatives are already available in these sectors. Furthermore, we studied trade barriers in a number of large economies, including the EU, China, the US, Brazil, and India. And the scope of the study was limited to 6 trade policy areas that are relatively simple to implement unilaterally or plurilaterally. As for the results, the report shows that climate-relevant goods and services faces a range of trade barriers that hamper emissions reductions by providing the wrong incentives, by increasing the costs of climate-relevant goods and services, and also delaying the transition to a climate-neutral world. And most importantly, trade policy is underutilized in helping to achieve climate goals. As regards tariffs, our study shows that there are still MFN tariffs on renewable energy goods and high MFN tariffs on cleaner transport goods. And this raises the cost for these goods and delays the deployment of climate-friendly technologies and makes it more costly to reach climate goals. Therefore, we recommend that the EU and other countries should take initiatives to reduce MFN tariffs via plurilateral agreements within initiatives such as, for example, a renewed and extended environmental goods agreement, or unilaterally, as for example, the UK has done in its new tariff schedule. But this could, of course, also be done multilaterally. Our analysis also show, as the minister just said, that even though trade remedies have long been heavily criticized for targeting environmental goods, renewable energy goods are still subject to such measure in a number of countries. And in this regard, we suggest that countries could pledge in a plurilateral agreement or even in a ministerial decision in the WTO to avoid targeting climate-relevant goods with trade remedies. Or countries could unilaterally amend their national policies to allow for climate considerations. The report also, for example, shows that the trade conflict between the to be investigated further. All in all, we conclude in this report that the countries have great potential to accomplish more within the trade policy area to support climate action. Our second report, it's on border carbon adjustment mechanism, and it was commissioned after the European Commission announced its intention to present a proposal for such a mechanism. However, today, at least in the EU, it's referred as a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM. So I'll call it a CBAM as well. So what is a CBAM? Without going into detail, a CBAM in the EU context would it would be a unilateral trade tool, and in the EU, it would most likely mean that the EU's emission trading system would be expanded to include emissions caused by imported goods, so that the importer would pay the same price as European companies. And the purpose of a CBAM, it would be to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage, and that is that the companies within the EU would move outside of the EU where it would be cheaper to produce. So by putting a price on the embedded carbon in the imported products on the same level as the price in the EU, you would avoid this risk. And we were asked to analyze trade-related aspects on border carbon adjustment mechanism and assess the possibilities for the introduction of such mechanism by the EU. We didn't assess if a CBAM should be implemented, even though a CBAM, often according to economic theory and modeling, is regarded as the most efficient unilateral tool for managing carbon leakage. But rather, our mission was to analyze if it can be designed in compliance with WTO rules. However, introducing such a system implies a number of practical, economic, legal, and political challenges. So in order to address these challenges, we put forward a number of recommendations for creating such a mechanism. And I'll just mention a few, focusing on the legal aspects, since I'm a lawyer. So from a legal perspective, a CBAM, a border carbon adjustment, can be designed in different ways. So therefore, the assessment of its legality, it would ultimately depend on how it would be designed in detail. But our assessment is, however, that it's possible to design a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be compatible with the legal framework in a way which would also create incentives for reduced emissions, and at the same time not result in excessive transaction costs either. Moreover, CBAM should, to as a large extent possibly, preferably be designed in line with the substantive rules and the non-discrimination obligations in the GATT. Secondly, our assessment is that an efficient CBAM has to be justified by the general exceptions of the GATT, at least to some extent. And this would require, most importantly, that the measure has a climate purpose to reduce carbon emissions. For the application of the general exceptions, it's also important that such a mechanism does not in practice lead to an arbitrary or unjustified discrimination or a disguised restriction of international trade. And in this regard, it's important that an open and an inclusive and a transparent process is conducted with affected countries within, for example, the WTO. So to conclude, what should you remember from this? There are a number of unilateral and plurilateral trade policy measures that have the potential to reduce carbon emissions. International trade can contribute to achieve the climate's goal by enabling the diffusion of more climate-friendly technologies or giving incentives for reduced emissions. With some political will, the WTO members could also take plurilateral, multilateral initiatives. Given the urgency of climate action, the need for trade policy that enable the transition to a more climate-friendly world is more important than ever. The WTO members and the WTO should take this opportunity and build back better from the COVID-19 crisis.
Great. Thank you very much, Emily, for that. We've had a poll that's gone up. I believe it's actually being posted again. And that poll really builds on some of the topics that you've raised in your presentation that have come up in your reports. So you've got 3 minutes, everybody who's attending in our audience, to indicate what you think the most important thing is the trade policy community can do to help achieve the Paris Agreement targets. While you're thinking over that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Suzanne Droga. She is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And Suzanne, you're going to take over the part of Emily's story that looks at border carbon adjustment mechanisms. I believe you're going to sort of unpack a little bit more of the detail and the process that might be required to develop such a WTO compatible mechanism. So over to you, Suzanne.
Yes, thanks a lot, Robert. I would like to follow up on what Emily already indicated by maybe first showing you the ideal way forward once a country or jurisdiction decides to implement this tool, before I talk a bit about the EU Commission's plans. Maybe we could switch the slide again. That would be lovely. And the next one, please. What you can see here is the result of a project that was conducted a few years back with some colleagues at the Climate Strategies Network, some are being in the room today. And it shows what to look at and which order would make a lot of sense once border carbon adjustment getting serious. Because it is all under the heading of a design along the WTO rules, just as Emily has elaborated. And just to guide you through a little bit is, once you've decided to use this tool to avoid carbon leakage, then you have to start a dialogue. You have to explain why you want to do this. And actually, this is the first question, what it would look like and why you want to do this, because we've seen this already this summer. Inquiries started in the WTO fora towards the EU. What are you planning? So, and once this is decided, you have to start the hard work by determining the scope and the coverage of what you have in mind. You have to notify your partners about the goods and sectors that should be covered, and of course, engage with affected countries bilaterally and in multilateral fora. A third step is to calculate the embedded carbon and to decide and to debate on what is the basis for this calculation. And this needs to be a participatory process as such, because you need the data, you need to have consent on what averages or default values should be applied and how that would make sense in order to address carbon leakage. And of course, this needs to be documented and transparent. The adjustment level is another case in point where you have to create processes that document, for instance, if a so-called benchmark is set, why and how could trade partners declare that they are meeting or are even better performing than this decided benchmark. And of course, independence of data collection and fact-based decisions are key. Now, another issue is, and that's a hot topic in the EU right now, what to do with the revenues. Because this is probably not something to put at the end of the process, but it comes along pretty quickly. If numbers are pretty high, then of course there are demands on the revenues. And given that we are talking here about a target of reducing the climate change challenge, this should be also part of cooperative approaches by offering, for instance, assistance to those countries that could be subject to a quota adjustment. And another topic that comes up is, when will this all be reviewed? Will it be reviewed, and doesn't it terminate itself? And I think a functioning system should exactly do that. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about what the EU Commission has announced, and I'm not proposing it here. I'm just trying to bring you all on one page. And the reasons for this measure, or considering this tool after many years of a theoretical consideration, is definitely that the Green Deal of the EU, with higher climate targets and carbon or climate neutrality by 2050, will bring about higher carbon costs to industries within the EU. There's still an open debate how these costs will occur. We have an emissions trading scheme here in Europe, and free allocation, which is behind the border measure to address carbon leakage, is well, it's going to go down, and that was decided already for the phase we're in. Also, a stricter cap on emissions will lead to a higher price, given that industry demand for certificates will be high. So given this higher cost, there is a higher risk of carbon leakage, and the idea now is to address this with the border measures. The mounting pressure on the carbon price at the moment is discussed in the context of leveling the field for competition within the EU. So for asking imports for a carbon price or demanding this at the border, and not for exports so far. Although a functioning border carbon adjustment could work both ways, because we can also see that some cleaner export could lose market shares abroad once they get more expensive. Now, the so-called CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism proposed by the European Commission, has three ingredients and options, and one is to introduce a carbon tax, a CO2 tax on particular products. That could be a tax in the context of the Energy Directive reform that is also placed with the Commission at the moment and part of a roadmap process. It could be an additional customs duty on imports to the EU, and it could be inclusion of importers under the emissions trading scheme, as mentioned by Emily. And you can, of course, place your bets on what is most likely. But as all the tools in the toolbox are under investigation right now, nobody can really. I wouldn't place a bet at the moment. Good. So That is, no experts included here, many open issues, a lot of excitement at the moment because consultations are running until the 28th of October. A first roadmap was released already in March, and comments were all coming from nearly 500 stakeholders. So these consultations are now in the second phase. The idea also, the last summit of heads of state and government has decided that the Commission has to come up with a proposal by 2021, latest in the summer. And this summit also drew a lot of attention on the revenues that could come along with such a tool. So we don't know what kind of political pressure will rise, whether it will rise from the revenue side. We all know the pandemic will cause a lot of demands on budgetary budgets of the governments, and own resources for the commissions are pretty attractive, and the carbon adjustment could be one of them. Now, coming back to the engagement with trade partners, the idea that the Commission has launched and that is supported by the President of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, caused a lot of excitement with trade partners already. And I think as we are talking here about a more proactive and positive approach to trade and climate and trade and sustainability, I think this tool needs to be judged upon in this context more than looking into whether or not it's compatible with the WTO. I think one of the strategic and tactical dimension we see is that probably the EU is only preparing to have fully thought it through. Maybe we will see this happening from the US when there's a change in government and nobody knows what the US means when they're talking about border carbon adjustments, because they want to, introduce some kind of carbon pricing. So probably this tool won't ever happen, but we will have a discussion that has some leverage on carbon pricing with other countries. Also, I think this measure has to be climate related only, as Emily has highlighted, not being a fiscal measure, creating revenues. This is really, really tricky, because this is something that trade partners do not like at all, to fill the budget of the EU at the border with their with prices for their imports along carbon content. Probably also the measure will not come as a at the border measure. We probably will see that the EU comes up with ideas behind the border. So this could happen, and this could be part of consultations. I think a combination of border adjustments and talks about carbon pricing, minimum pricing, is a good idea with trade partners. There are many countries out there that have a carbon price in place. They will raise questions, and these need to be addressed. And yeah, explaining it over and over again is part of the story, as I made the point I made in the beginning. So happy to discuss or hear from you what you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for unpacking a little bit what Emily was talking about. And I've learned, of course, this new acronym CBAM that I will use consistently from now on. So now we've looked at CBAM, Border Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, and we're going to sort of unpack perhaps the other side that Emily has talked about, and which was referred to extensively actually by the Minister, which is really the extent to which there are options on the table for the trade policy community to address the issues such as tariffs and remedies and other barriers to establishing a circular economy. And to help us do that, we're very grateful and happy to have Clara Brandi with us, who is a senior researcher at the German Development Institute. So Clara, let you make your opening intervention before we invite all three panelists to come back for a discussion. Over to you, Clara.
Many thanks, Robert, and many thanks to my previous speakers. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. So making progress at the multilateral level would, of course, be the first best solution. But since that's very difficult, and in light of time running out very quickly, there's an urgent need, I think, to focus on other solutions, using plurilateral or preferential agreements, trade agreements, to leverage climate action. And the hope is, of course, that these kind of agreements can then create positive spillovers for the multilateral process in the WTO to help build back better and to help promote the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As in fact can be seen in this slide here, trade agreements include ever more environmental provisions. And the black line on the left shows how the average number of these environmental provisions has been rising fast since the 1990s. Feel free to explore in more detail the content of these provisions on this website indicated here, trendanalytics.info, which visualizes this database with data collected by Professor Jean-Frédéric Morin and his team to really dive deep into the details of what kind of environmental content different countries have inserted into their trade agreements over time. And as you can see in the next slide, these trade agreements already include many provisions that do address climate change. Many of these address renewable energy or energy efficiency, but there are also a number of trade agreements that directly address climate mitigation and also adaptation efforts. So that's a good basis to move forward. At the same time, however, despite their great potential, the contribution of these provisions in trade agreements remains underexplored, underutilized, as Emily also mentioned previously. Although some trade agreements do include some detailed commitments regarding different other environmental issues like biodiversity, forestry, fisheries, also endangered species, they include only very sparse, few, and rather vague commitments on climate action. So overall, there's a lot of potential that still remains to be untapped. So more concretely, what can be done? Firstly, I think first and foremost, really an easily achievable aim, and also as also underlined by Emily in her study that she presented, a really good win-win start might be to enhance liberalization for climate-related goods and services. And this is clearly a win-win solution, as it would contribute both to trade liberalization, promoting trade, but also fighting climate change. Yet even this relatively uncontroversial issue remains ignored by most recent trade agreements. So again, underutilized, underused. Secondly, another option that the EU has gone for is to demand not only the ratification, but also the implementation of agreements like the Paris Agreement as a requirement to conclude a new trade agreement. And this could, of course, help reduce the risk of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement going ahead into looking into the future. So this is another example of how climate provisions could be introduced into trade agreements going forward. A complementary option is to not only introduce climate provisions in trade agreements, but also include trade provisions in climate plans, for example, in national climate plans under the Paris Agreement, the NDCs. And as you can see in this slide, already there are some references to trade. Around 45 of all NDCs under the Paris Agreement do contain some trade-related provisions. But at the same time, only 22 of them, only 22 NDCs do include trade provisions that are really focused on strengthening climate mitigation. So there's again considerable potential to be still leveraged. And last but not least, let me mention another third option, for example, very much proposed by Nobel laureate Nordhaus, which is to use trade measures as an incentive to create climate clubs. So coalitions of front runners, coalitions of countries going ahead with strong mitigation commitments, and using trade measures as incentives or penalties on countries, incentives for countries to join, raise their ambition level, but also penalties on countries that do not participate in these climate clubs. And as recent research indicates, there are actually quite a few environmental agreements out there that already help to promote trade. So there are in fact already actual environmental clubs out there, and this shows that there's potential to actually use these trade incentives to go forward and create more environmental clubs and also climate clubs looking into the future. So overall, in sum, including climate provisions in trade agreements, including trade provisions in climate agreements, for example, in the NDCs, but also trying to use trade as a measure to create or promote climate clubs really shows that there's untapped potential going ahead, and that we should leverage this potential to more effectively to help build back better, to help promote the Paris Agreement and also the implementation of the SDGs. And I look forward, to more discussions and questions with all of you and also with the participants.
Clara, thank you so much for that and the clarity of your 3 different pathways here. Climate into trade, trade into climate, and then looking at these clubs as well. Really, really clear for us, I think, to get to grips with in our panel discussion. Could I ask our host to put up the results from our second poll, which tried to gauge the temperature of our audience when it comes to the different mechanisms that we've been talking about. Interesting, again, we've got a lot of people who are not answering, perhaps reserving their position, waiting to hear more from the panel. And of course, we've got a wild card in there on fossil fuel subsidies. We'll come to that in due course, perhaps during the panel. But perhaps I can follow up with the panel, perhaps start with you, Clara, but feel free, any member of the panel, to come in on this. You talked about these 3 options, and you talked about using plurilateral agreements and unilateral agreements. I'm just wondering, perhaps you can talk a little bit about what do you see as the role of the WTO in, pushing forward with any of those 3 options, and indeed also in supporting either the plurilateral or unilateral approaches?
Yeah, that's a very good question and not easy to answer. I mean, I think I have a very positive view on plurilateral and also preferential approaches to linking trade and climate, because these can provide options to experiment, to innovate, to try out new solutions. And of course, the hope is that these plurilateral or preferential approaches will demonstrate in practical terms how trade rules can support climate action, and how they can help to hopefully generate momentum towards an eventual multilateral set of solutions. And I think that should be the ultimate aim. So let's take, for example, the negotiations on the reductions of trade barriers for environmental goods and services. This is a plurilateral set of negotiations, and hopefully it will resume speed and show a way forward also for potentially multilateral action. Let's also take ACTS, the new approach to negotiating an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability by a set of countries. These countries explicitly underline that they support the multilateral progress, but that they want to make progress and be an inspiration for other countries to bring together these different objectives. And what can the WTO do? I think the WTO and other international organizations, they should help foster this kind of learning, experimentation, innovation process, and help to promote a dialogue on how to leverage these innovations in different approaches like trade agreements and perhaps also in the multilateral negotiations.
Thanks, Claire. Perhaps I can turn to Emily. Emily, you've got a legal background. You know about the WTO. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit from the legal point of view what the options are for member states and the WTO in relation to these sorts of agreements.
Well, as I already mentioned, in our reports, we show that there are a lot the WTO members can do themselves within the existing legal framework in order to support climate. And as regards the WTO, one of its core functions is rightly to provide a forum for negotiations among the members. So both for current matter, but also for future issues and agreements. So that would of course, be the ultimate solution, some kind of multilateral or plurilateral negotiations. And besides this, I can also mention it has, for example, it's suggested by James Bacchus, who's a former member of the appellate body, that the WTO members could adopt a collective climate waiver in order to support member states' unilateral initiatives. Such a waiver could permit the WTO members to adopt measures that are legally uncertain or contrary to the WTO commitments. So since there's an overwhelming risk that that measures protecting climate would be perceived as protectionist measures, this could be a way to avoid lengthy and costly trade disputes due to the lack of WTO jurisprudence and uncertainties of the legal boundaries of the WTO rules. And this could also be a first step before the WTO membership revise and realign the WTO rules in order to further promote the objectives of sustainable development.
Thanks, Emily. I'm very happy to see that some people are beginning to use the chat function to send in questions. That's super fantastic. Thank you very much, Ronald, for kicking us off there. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I think I'd like to encourage others in the audience to use that so we can begin to source some ideas for questions from the floor. I wanted to follow up briefly with Clara before going back to Suzanne, actually. And Clara, you talked about bringing trade measures into the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, key mechanism of the Paris Agreement. But I just want to ask you, is that really going to do enough, or is it more about establishing coherence and signaling intention rather than having real bite?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. On the one hand, you could say that trade agreements might have more bite than the NDCs. At the same time, of course, it makes sense to use these trade climate linkages in all different kinds of fora that countries are involved in. And so if they discover the potential of linking trade and climate in the context of trade negotiations, then it also makes sense to use the same win-win solutions in the context of their climate policies and the negotiations of the UNFCCC. So while the NDCs remain, of course, voluntary contributions, voluntary commitments by states, the Paris Agreement itself is of course part of international law and is supposed to be watching over the NDCs being implemented. So I would say it makes sense to, yes, use different fora for countries to have, yeah, consistent linkages in all the different negotiations and policy approaches. And of course, also in the NDCs, linking trade and climate can, of course, really, can really provide a basis for different type of actors to understand and make use of the potential of these linkages. And I think introducing trade measures in the NDCs can actually help to promote this idea in the climate community more than probably the other way around. So in that sense, I think it's a promising strategy to do both, introduce climate measures in trade agreements, but also try to think about these win-win solutions of including trade measures in climate negotiations and the NDCs.
Thanks, Clara. I want to bring in actually the question we've received from Ronald Steenbleek, who's sent into all panelists the following, and I think it follows up quite nicely from what we've just been talking about. And he asks, he'd like to hear what the panelists think about the strategy implicit in the approach being taken by the 6 parties to the Plurilateral Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, known as ACTS. And that implicit strategy is by adding members after those parties, those 6 members have reached agreement, you hope to sort of reach a stage where you multilateralize the agreement itself. Do you think that that is, what's your opinion about that? Is that going to work? Is it something that has a hope of success?
Maybe let me start. I think I've already expressed my optimism regarding these negotiations as providing some new impetus for multilateral action. And I think it's good to negotiate these agreements with this open kind of approach in the hope that new members will join. Of course, they won't have been able to shape the terms of the agreement, but at least they will have some transparency in terms of what has been discussed in which way. And I think keeping these negotiations open for other parties to join can provide some basis for eventually multilateralizing the agreement in the longer run.
Emily, can I ask you, are there any sort of legal aspects to building up from plurilateral to multilateral, or can you just sort of go ahead and do it?
Well, I haven't studied the agreement in detail, but there are many different options and ways that plurilateral agreements have become multilateral agreements. So I would stay positive as well that if there's a will, I'm sure the WTO members could find a way.
Thanks, Emily. And as a way of bridging a little bit between talking about the plurilateral approaches and win-wins in this area, I wanted to come back to what Clara mentioned, these climate clubs. And in my mind, I could see there being potential overlap between climate clubs and the CBAM type of approach, the border carbon adjustment approach. And we've actually got a question again from our audience about this that I'd like to ask Suzanne in the first instance. It's from Harold van Asselt, and he says some have suggested a climate club using border and carbon adjustments. To what extent is that realistic, and how would countries and other actors interested in establishing such a club need to move such an idea forward? So Suzanne, perhaps you can address that question.
Yeah, I think what the idea goes back to is an old idea with environmental agreements that you need some kind of sanction to make countries cooperate on something that is a global public good, right? So the problem here is why should one join such a club when it's costly? So where are the benefits? So, and in this kind of thinking, the benefit would be if you use it for the CBAM or border adjustment, that the club members do not have to adjust at the border when they trade with each others. But then again, I think also it is the idea behind is truly is a carbon pricing club idea. So these members will probably have more or less agreed on a carbon price anyway. So a border adjustment would only make sense to third parties, and that is the threat. I would perceive it as a threat, as a sanction, so that if you want to trade with big countries that join this club or made up the club, you have to adjust your climate policy accordingly. I mean, this has a lot of charm. You bring in really the hard stuff by threatening, trade measures against them. But then again, it's power politics. I wonder where you will get a critical mass from in order to set this club up. I don't think the EU would do this because it has no sparring partner and is really, really at the moment not decided on whether or not we'll bring up the CBAM or install it. Let's see, wait and see. And I think a driver could be the US for sure. And it could use any plan to introduce carbon pricing to build up a coalition. And so I'm a bit like, I think the problem is that it is a very aggressive way to signal to other countries in the world that you're serious about carbon pricing. I am rather cautious about this, whether it will fly, because it's a long distance run. It's not something you do 1 or 2 years and then you abolish it because it works so well. I think it needs a constant setup that is, I do not see it happening as long as the WTO is in such a state as we see it right now.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. There's quite a detailed question here, also from the floor, which you have actually in your wonderful diagram of the different steps, design steps for a border adjustment, and it's specifically about monitoring emissions from trading partners. How is it possible to do that? How can you do it in a way that's credible?
I think we are in a state where we have increasing knowledge about carbon footprints and carbon content and embedded carbon. The numbers are there, but probably only for specific goods and sectors, so basic materials. So it is possible to have an idea about some default values maybe, by tracking and tracing and monitoring all the detailed emissions that are in a final good, like just this mobile, right? I think this is not where we will start. Also, along the lines I described, the debates are more than that. Also, according to the WTO, you must not discriminate against your trade partners. You need to establish some kind of average value that is, for instance, the performance across the European Union, which is probably better than in some other countries. If you use this as the assumption of the carbon content for imports, this is a more generous way to allow countries to, adjust not for the real emissions they may have. And if they perform much better than the EU average, they should be allowed to show that they perform much better. And so this very much depends on international knowledge on embedded carbon. It's possible. We have tracking projects running. I think that this discussion on the CBAM will trigger even more the way how we measure carbon that is being traded. And of course, in economics, we have input-output tables, what have you, where you can attach the carbon content to what is flowing among sectors. But of course, it's not a straightforward way to implement this kind of system and to monitor the emissions. You need to use assumptions, and you need to have rules on how to challenge the assumption if some imports are performing much better than the country that implies a CBAM wants them to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Suzanne. One thing that the minister mentioned in her opening intervention was talking a little bit about the emerging economies and developing countries. And a question I've got for anyone in the panel is really how can we design the right sorts of trade policies that will enable the scaling out of the sorts of technologies that will mitigate carbon emissions? Are there things that we need to take specific account of when thinking about the situation of developing and emerging economies? Perhaps Clara might want to take that one first.
Yeah, I think emerging economies, developing countries have also an interest in these win-win solutions. So I think one could say that yes, reducing trade barriers for better diffusion of these kinds of technologies is beneficial for all kinds of countries. Of course, there might be differences across countries when it comes to production possibilities and ways of making use of these technologies. But I think in general, I would be quite open to the suggestion that this would be in the interest of all kinds of countries. At the same time, it makes sense to think about complementary measures like technology transfer or technology banks to make sure that there are additional measures for making for safeguarding that technologies can be used also in developing countries to promote production possibilities or being integrated into global value chains in that regard.
Thanks very much, Clara. Suzanne, are there specific things around border carbon adjustments that need to be taken into account when thinking from the perspective of the emerging economies and developing countries?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. I mean, the elaborations on how a border adjustment could look like come up with some guidance that says exempt those countries that are poor from the scheme and those who are not really the poor ones, but the emerging ones with emission-intensive industries. Of course, they would be hit by this measure. So that is why I was indicating that the process needs to be carefully designed. And with them, there need to be really many talks on how to, how to get on with such a solution. Is it a threat? And one could move for instance, China. Let's look at China. Make them move into a direction where they really invest in cleaner production. And we have here a risk that China, for instance, would reshuffle its production by exporting the cleaner stuff to the EU to avoid the border adjustment, while then, selling, for instance, coal-based products, processes that use a lot of coal in the electricity production, sell it at home, and so split their production into exports and domestic use. And I think for those countries it's a serious threat, but actually it is meant as a threat in these circumstances once there is non-cooperation in the Paris Agreement. I think this matters most for the talks. I think that if there are signals that countries are willing to implement the NDCs and scale them up, that's just as we had an announcement by China last week, you can go into detailed talks about carbon pricing. But if that's not the case, I think the BCA used as a stick will trigger a higher interest in talking about serious climate action. So that is more or less how I see it. I see a clear exemption clause for poor countries that depend on particular export, because it's simply the numbers that don't matter so much. I think if you really want to address carbon leakage and protect the climate, it's not them that cause a lot. It is other countries, emerging ones, and those with still high fossil fuel use. And I think this is tough. You would need to play hardball if you want to introduce a quota adjustment towards imports from those countries. That's the way it is going to go if the EU, for instance, would scale this up.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Emily, how about you? What about the perspective of development and developing countries?
Yes, well, there's an obvious risk that a BCA or a CBAM for developing countries could result in cost and become an administrative burden and complicate for companies from developing and countries and make it hard for them to export to the EU. And in this regard, we point out in our report that it may be necessary to observe the different levels of economic development of the different members. And this would be in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in the Paris Agreement, but also in line with the principle of special and differential treatment in the WTO. According to which the developing countries can receive trade preferences or technical assistance or relief from certain commitments. And I can just say that in our report, we recommend that at least least developed countries should also be exempted from the measure. But how this should be designed in more detail, it would have to be examined further. And we also recommend in our report that the revenues from the CBAM should be used to reduce administrative burden and for climate action. And both these things would also be important for the assessment of the CBAM under the general exception rules and to make it compatible with the WTO rules.
Thanks very much, Emily. I think we're going to see the results for our third poll in a moment, and even less participation this time on trade-offs that need to be taken into account on border carbon adjustments. We've now got about 25 minutes or so remaining in our session, and we have a guiding question that we've like to pose to the participants, our audience, and we'd like to give you the opportunity of commenting and intervening. To do so, you need to raise your hand, and once you've done so, our colleagues in Geneva will be able to offer you the floor. Just to remind you, our guiding question is: what is the most important thing what is the most important thing the trade policy community can do to help achieving the Paris Agreement targets? What is the most important thing the trade policy community can do to help achieve the Paris Agreement targets? So if you feel that you would like to intervene on that point and provide your own perspective on that, we'd love to hear from you. While you're getting your thoughts in order, perhaps I can follow up with the panel and ask them if they were a minister, like Minister that we heard from earlier, Minister Hallberg, which policy would you choose to introduce to ensure an alignment between trade and climate? And I'll start off with Suzanne.
Yes, of course. That's, I think, from the academic world, we hear a lot of, as we just elaborated, a lot of evaluations why trade ministers have the tough thing to do on an everyday basis. So I think, first of all, if you're in the EU and you have in times of trade conflict and decoupling ambitions around the globe, a declining will to support multilateralism. You have to take care of these really broad issues. And I think while I had the role to talk about border adjustment, which are really rather a stick than everything else, I think we have reached the times where this stick is probably needed. And as a trade minister, I couldn't resist probably to every now and then hint at these plans made by the EU. While actually for me, it seems absolutely important to reignite the talks about productive, cooperative trade deals that incorporate social standards, that incorporate environmental and sustainability standards beyond just clauses. Because the work done by Laval University and the GDI on the database, of course, this is a lot of lip service. We know that the text is really patient, as we know from other international agreements. But as a trade minister, I would really insist on this type of agenda. I would also I would really promote the ACTS agreement as a case in point. It still lacks a lot of critical mass. And it was initiated basically by trade ministers. And I think this needs to be supported. So I would definitely go for a positive agenda, while the risk is that US policy will continue that puts so much stress on international trade relations and on the multilateral system, which is the key problem at the moment to me.
Thank you, Suzanne, the assertive trade and climate minister. Now I hand over to Clara to see what approach she would take as a minister.
Yes, I agree with this positive agenda of my colleague. I would support her measures. I think it makes sense to focus on this positive linkage in trade policy. And I think it makes sense to support the negotiations of acts and similar negotiations going forward. I think as a trade minister, I would also try to tackle the problem of or try to promote the problem of tackling fossil fuel subsidies and potentially using trade rules to support this important endeavor. And I would, I guess, try to make use of these trade measures in environmental agreements, because we talked about carbon border adjustment as sticks to promote climate clubs. And we heard about the challenges in this context. And we heard about also repercussions and challenges of border carbon adjustments more generally. But there's actually a way forward also, again, for a more positive agenda in this regard on clubs, because as I mentioned, our research shows that these trade liberalizing provisions in environmental agreements, also potentially in climate club agreements, can actually generate more trade flows among members. So this is not the stick, but this is the carrot to increase incentives for other countries to join, or to raise ambition levels, or to increase incentives to implement the climate action commitments in such a climate club. So I'm also hopeful that in the context of this idea of a climate club, we can not only think about this negative stick option, but also about the carrot option that seems to be out there really in sight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clara. A carrot and a stick from Minister Brandy. Emily, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot as promoting you to being minister in Sweden. What would you choose?
Well, I think Suzanne and Clara had many good suggestions that I would support as well. But ultimately, from my background, I would prefer a multilateral or plurilateral solutions within the WTO. But in the meantime, as we showed in our reports, there are so many things that the trade policy community could do unilaterally within the existing rules. So I would try to do both, pursue both avenues and do as much as possible for climate.
Thank you, Emily, Clara, and Suzanne. And now I hear that there are at least two of our participants who would like to answer our guiding questions. So I hand over to Geneva to unmute them in the order that they raise their hands. Please introduce yourself. Please be as concise and specific as you possibly can. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Welcome, Harro.
Okay, hi. Yeah, sorry. I've been put on the spot a little bit. I must admit that I wasn't expecting this, and my daughter just came home, so she's crying next door. Hi, everyone. So I guess I'm answering the same question, putting on a minister's hat and trying not to repeat the panelists. So I'll say something different, and I think what I'll say is something about the process of making trade agreements, and I think that has hardly been discussed so far. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is that trade agreements still in many countries and in many circles are made by trade policymakers with, to some extent, some input from broader communities, but still relatively limited. And I think if I were in a position to make sure that trade agreements work indeed for broader societal goals, not just the Paris Agreement, but also the SDGs, I would certainly try to create a process domestically that focuses on securing as much input as possible, but also securing scientific input as possible. So I know there are suggestions for sustainable or a climate impact assessment of trade agreements. And it's along these ways that I would try and strengthen domestic processes rather than ultimately expecting Geneva to come up with solutions.
Thanks very much, Harro, for those specific and slightly different sort of perspectives on this. Over to our next audience member, please. Do we have another intervention from among our audience? Geneva, let us know. Are we expecting anyone else?
Daniel, can you speak? You're being unmuted.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask for, I wasn't raising the hand, that's why. But if you want, I can give a view on it, yeah.
Please, Daniele, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, if I can expand a bit on the development countries problem that we were talking about before as well, I was thinking that there is a need to provide something for the other countries. And I was thinking about the Ecuador president, Correa, that in his presidential time came up with an idea to find some support, some international support to finance the protection of a forest in his country where oil could be digged. And he tried to get money to not actually produce oil from there. So the idea is, can we find things to give to them in order to avoid productions made with polluting energy sources?
I wonder whether that is something that falls under one of the categories that we haven't really addressed, but Clara had it in one of her entrances, sort of went quickly past us, but feels like it might be a bit of an elephant in the room. We've talked so much about different approaches of trying to deal with reducing tariffs, essentially, freeing up trade to make sure that the transition and the new technologies can be, made available as cheaply WTO as quickly as possible. We've talked about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but then we also briefly perhaps heard about another of the key sort of aspects within the trade discussions, which is fossil fuel subsidies. And I just wonder whether we've got an elephant in the room that we haven't addressed, and whether if we look at all of these different approaches, whether in fact the one that gives you sort of most bang for your buck, if you like, is to deal with fossil fuel subsidies. Clara, is that something that you think we're underappreciating as being a key part of this discussion around aligning trade and climate policy?
Yes, I think it is indeed a key part of this discussion, and it is very important because the combustion of fossil fuels contributes roughly 65% to all global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a substantial share of emissions, and as we know, many governments are supporting fossil fuel subsidies with subsidy programs and assisting producers and consumers of fossil fuels. And of course, that's a big problem if we want to address the climate crisis. And of course, many international organizations have acknowledged the importance of these subsidy programs, but little has happened so far. So yes, I think, again, there is substantial room for improvement, and trade rules can support this agenda of limiting fossil fuel subsidies. As we know, of course, this is not foreign territory to trade agreements to discipline subsidies. At the same time, it's not easy, but we hope that perhaps we can also learn from the negotiations of fishery subsidies as part of the Doha WTO mandate, which happens partly for environmental reasons. And the hope is that progress in this area of reducing fishery subsidies can also set a blueprint and provide some insights into how fossil fuel subsidies can be reduced going forward and how trade rules can play a part in this. And in fact, the ACTS negotiations that we talked about, they also put a spotlight on reducing fossil fuel subsidies. So again, here are plurilateral negotiations that are taking up this important issue of linking trade and climate, and hopefully they can also provide some insights into how in a multilateral setting fossil fuel subsidies can be addressed by trade rules.
Thanks very much, Clara. And for those people in our audience who are really interested in getting into more detail around fossil fuel subsidies, there is a dedicated panel and session on this on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in the morning European time. We're moving into the last 10 minutes or so of this session. And I wanted to return to maybe where we started with, particularly with the minister's speech and intervention. There are two things I wanted to follow up on. One is the environmental goods agreement. And I want to hear perhaps from Emily a little bit and other panelists. What's the prospect of getting the environmental goods agreement back on track? What are the options open to us, and how far will it actually address the issues that you set out in the first report from the National Board of Trade around tariffs and remedies? So that's one of the key instruments that I think that we need to address when thinking about being forward-looking, being action-oriented over the next 12 months or so. So perhaps Emily, you might want to reflect on that, and other panelists too.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's a political question. There's a political lack of will for the negotiations right now. So there would really need to be this political will to get into the negotiation room again. But I don't think it's impossible. And then you ask something about the relevance of the environmental goods agreements, and bearing in mind that the technology have developed so much since the negotiations were suspended. And I think the focus was mostly on goods. So I think you would have to have a new approach. You would have to look further into services, and also include more, have a new look at the goods that were suggested back then. And I can also mention that my colleagues who were writing the report on trade barriers, they also developed a list on goods that could be included into these negotiations.
Thanks very much, Emily. Suzanne, what about you? I mean, in terms of the environmental goods agreement, I mean, what's the prospects that it might come up back up? Emily is saying that maybe it needs to be expanded, and need to look at services. Is another approach to scale it back, to make it more manageable? What do you think?
I mean, beyond the political will, which is the true argument, we will probably get nowhere with this setting we have at the moment, or we have experienced until 2016, because as long as the two flaws will not be corrected for. First is there is no real definition of what constitutes an environmental good. And so countries bring up things that probably will be contested by other countries, whether or not they belong to the list. So starting with the list, I think, look at the agreements that say list those you want to exempt, and by default you have whatever categories that are on the list automatically. So probably turn it upside down. I don't know. It's about liberalization, and the approach of a positive list is politically very tricky. The second point is, these are two things: the positive list plus the definition. And I think in order to get back to a start, you need to have you have to make up in your mind what flies politically when you talk about specific sectors and about the technologies that are not probably there, which are brand new. So not talking about the bicycle, the classical example, but talking about the hydrogen electrolysis that is the latest state of whatever, and to have to free this technology from whatever the trade barriers could be. I don't know, but I think it needs the nucleus from where to start. And I think again that these acts initiative is such a nucleus. While, of course, if you include something where you not have big stakes in, that's probably the very easy way forward, but politically is a signal that is very important. So I think the key is how to handle these two flaws and how to get to new ground when you want to start this process. And of course, actors like the EU are bound or more or less stuck in this tradition that they had to set it up. They brought it from APEC into a new process, and the debates already run on Twitter who was in charge of what and what it all means and who gets credits. And yeah, I think I would pledge for a fresh start here.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. A fresh start. So how do we, Clara, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to sort of slightly reframe this question because the minister also talked about the need for some sort of declaration at MC12. It's been talked about. What do you think that declaration should say if it's going to in some way reignite the sort of discussions moving towards multilateralism that are needed?
That's an important question. I think indeed that while such a declaration doesn't really guarantee for actual change, it's a signal. Again, it's an important signal, would be an important signal of member states in the WTO to make sure that they have this important issue of linking trade and climate on their agenda and high on their agenda. And this is important because, as we know, time is running out. So I think having the statement in the first place would already be a big success, independent of the details of what would be in the statement. And then I would hope for a positive agenda and for showing really win-win potentials that can help build some of the political will that we know is missing in many contexts.
Thanks very much, Clara. I'm going to try and round off our session now. It's been very rich discussion. I want to put us back into context a little bit. This December will be the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And just recently, the UK and the UNFCCC came out again to say that they really want to see countries stepping up and improving, putting more flesh on the bones of NDCs, and making better commitments, greater commitments in those NDCs. And there is also a huge amount of momentum behind different types of transition activities, energy transitions, industry transitions, where companies in the cement sector, in the steel sector, are moving ahead to create this economy of the future. And really the opportunity seems to be there for the trade community, for the WTO, to provide some of that economic backbone, governance backbone, to the sort of transitions that are envisaged. We've heard about, if you like, the approach of having a stick, of using this sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism in some way, which may well be possible under the WTO if designed in a very careful way, but it's also about providing leverage and being a platform for discussion around carbon pricing, around broader trade liberalization for climate ends. And we've also then heard a lot about different unilateral and plurilateral approaches to dealing with barriers to trade, and the opportunities there of experimentation, but building on those, not just having a series of clauses, but having standards, as Suzanne said, actually doing things that are specific and have bite, and perhaps marrying those with, as our Harrow said from the fore, with breaking down the silos between making trade policy and making climate and perhaps even industry policy to have real coherence across the piece, and bringing science in so that we actually know which policies are delivering emission reductions. So it's a great agenda to get to grips with, and I think that there's a lot of expectation that MC12 and the political will can be re-established in the middle of next year or even before then. Thank you very much to a fantastic panel, Emily, Suzanne and Clara. Thanks also to our helpers in Geneva, and also to all of you in our audience. It was a real pleasure.